So I want to talk a little bit about informal fallacies. Now, an informal fallacy is an error in the content of the premise. It differs from a formal fallacy. A formal fallacy is where we have an error in the structure. So remember, structure is soundness. Truth comes from the content of our premise. So with an informal fallacy, we can still have a sound argument. The conclusion just won't be true because one of our premises are wrong. And remember, with all fallacies, it's not that the conclusion is false because we have a fallacy in it. It just means that our premises are either not true or not reasoned well. So a fallacy doesn't state that the conclusion is definitively false. It just says this line of reasoning will not produce a reliable conclusion. So let's look at an example of an informal fallacy. Premise 1, all mammals have 6 legs. Premise 2, a squirrel is a mammal. Therefore, a squirrel has 6 legs. Now this is false because of the first premise, all mammals have 6 legs. We know that that is a false statement, so our conclusion is going to come out false. So here we have an informal fallacy where the information in premise 1 is false and therefore leads to a false conclusion. Now let's look at example 2. Premise 1, Mr. Smith is a vegetarian. Premise 2, vegetarians are not real men. Therefore, Mr. Smith is not a real man. Now I put real in quotation marks, but let's assume that we actually meant a real man. So if we don't want vegetarians in being men, we'll just change the definition. And it makes it so our definition is not solid. And it's changing the definition to exclusively make the group look good. So unless the definition of man is supposed to fit exclusively everybody except vegetarians, we can't accept that the conclusion is true. So this is a no true Scotsman fallacy. Let's look at the next one. Here we have 2 plus 3 equals 5. A dog is an animal, therefore your opinion is invalid. So all 3 of these is true. However, there is no logical flow. So this is a non sequitur. It's kind of a mix between a formal and an informal fallacy, because we're presenting a structure that isn't even remotely connected. The premises can be true, but they don't follow to the conclusion. So this is an example of a non sequitur. Let's look at the next one. Premise 1, you said smoking is bad. Premise 2, you smoke. Therefore, smoking is not bad. Well, no matter whether or not someone smokes is going to be independent to whether or not smoking is bad. So this is called a tu quoque fallacy, because whether or not someone acts hypocritical to what their claim is doesn't make that claim not true. Looking at this next one, Dave said wealth inequality in America is a problem. Dave is a socialist, therefore Dave is wrong on wealth inequality in America. So is it true that socialists can never be right? Should we simply just dismiss anything socialists say because they are socialists? Well, this is called the genetic fallacy. What happens when we commit a genetic fallacy is we dismiss someone's points purely on where that point is coming from. This argument is basically saying because it came from a socialist, it has to be wrong, and that's not true. Socialists can be right on things, can't they? They can even be right on the main position that they're talking about, or they could be wrong, but just because it came from a socialist, or any person for that matter, doesn't make the claim false. So a lot of these fallacies, the informal ones in particular, are usually used conversationally. So I really wanted to look at what these look like in everyday talk. So let's look at this first one. Bob says, does Chick-fil-A have good food? And his friend John will reply, I guess I can't stomach a chicken sandwich when I think of how homophobic they are. John isn't answering Bob's question here. He's diverting this whole conversation to, instead of about how good the food is, he's talking about the character and setting this scenario up to where Bob isn't going to want to eat at Chick-fil-A anyways. So this is an example of poisoning the well. When someone asks you a question that isn't related to ethics and you respond to something that's going to be totally tearing down of someone's character so that they're not even going to want to try it anyways. Looking at this next example here, we're going to say Bob says, "I think affirmative action is sometimes necessary." John will retort, "So you think people should be hired on race and gender rather than qualification?" So this is an example of a straw man. Bob states a certain position, and John's going to sum it up to a point where Bob isn't even going to agree with this. It's an assertion placed forth that has some unfair assumptions built into Bob's position. And the whole point of creating this straw man fallacy is so that you could knock it down easier. But if the person you're debating against doesn't even agree with it, what's the point? So this is the straw man fallacy. Bob says, "I love the new Garfield movie." John says, "It came from DreamWorks. It couldn't be good." So this right here is once again dismissing a claim just based on where it was from. This is another form of the genetic fallacy. So we know that DreamWorks might make 1,000 bad movies, but that doesn't mean that their new one couldn't be good. An anomaly. There we go. Here we go. John says, "I saw Bigfoot yesterday." Bob, "Can you show me his footprints?" John says in retort, "No, but you can't prove I didn't see him." So here we have a unfair shifting of the burden of proof. Here we have John making the positive claim that I saw Bigfoot yesterday. But he's not. So if he makes this positive claim, he's the one that has to present forth evidence. We don't just believe everything. We only believe things that people have substantially proven. So it's not on Bob to prove it if it's John's claim. So John can't just shove the burden over to Bob and say, "Well, now you have to prove this," and then run off. So this is the shifting of the burden of proof fallacy. What about this last one? John, "Bob, you are wrong about fallacies." And Bob says, "I don't believe I am." Then John retorts, "I saw your record. You got through college with a 2.4 GPA. So this is a type of fallacy that most of us are common to. This is an ad hominem fallacy, where we dismiss someone's claim because of a flaw in their character. Now, this is different from an ad hominem attack. An ad hominem attack would have been just this last part. "I saw your record. You got a 2.4 GPA," and not address the claim. But if John is saying that Bob is false because of his 2.4 GPA, then that is actually a fallacy because he's assessing the truth value. So if John was to just tell Bob he's stupid, that wouldn't be an ad hominem fallacy unless he said, "Bob, I don't believe about what you're saying about fallacies because you're stupid." There has to be that link between claim and attack.